我们继续回来跟山东大学的贝淡宁教授来做访谈。Professor Bell, within the couple years, there's a growing sense of there's more and more control in the campus as well as in the media. But contradictory, there's another phenomenon that you also mentioned this morning, that people in private can talk whatever they like. They can even criticize the Communist Party. How come there's such this contradictory phenomenon, and how is that can fit into the model of meritocracy?
So it's not just in private, but I think in classroom settings, it's surprisingly, free. Even in my area, which is political theory, which ought to be very sensitive, but and also depends how far you are from Beijing. I mean, in Beijing, I think somehow you feel the political pressure more than, for example, in Shandong, and I think it's true in other parts of China as well. And the social media is very vibrant, like now, when I first came to China, 15 years ago, there was maybe fewer formal constraints on freedom of speech, but I felt that it was hard for me to get information. But now I can subscribe to social media sites, some of which are more liberal in orientation, some are more socialist in orientation, some are more Confucian in orientation, and I feel I have more access to diverse information than I did when I first came to China. But it requires effort, but with a bit of effort, I think it's relatively easy, to be frank, to get around the constraints and to have access to quite diverse sources of information.
So you think that the control or there's more restraint these days is going to go away, or is it going to be as part of the...
Well, I think in the long term, maybe this is blind optimism, but there'll be fewer controls. I mean, if only because the society is becoming much more pluralistic, and even on issues directly related to meritocracy, right? I mean, in the period of reform, there was basically a consensus among intellectuals and reformers that the key priority for government should be poverty reduction. The best means for that is economic growth. So let's try to promote officials based on their ability to deliver economic growth. And we don't have to argue too much about that. But now the priorities are not obvious. Should it be economic growth? Should it be
environment?
Should it be environment? Should it be reducing gap between rich and poor? Should it be like dealing with challenge of AI? I mean, and there's a need for much more open environment to discuss those issues and to think about how to prioritize them. I think that's bound to happen. So on the one hand, I think there's increased demands for freedom of speech, and arguably more kind of information available for those who make special effort to seek that information. But on the other hand, there are growing formal constraints, and I think that's a kind of contradiction that was not sustainable.
Let me ask one of your pieces on Wall Street Journal. The title is called "Why Anyone Can Be Chinese." This has caused quite a big debate. What you want to say is being a Chinese is not based on race, but on cultural identity. What do you find most interesting about those responses, or the people who disagree with you, and what do you want to say in this piece?
Well, okay, so it's not just my view. I mean, I think it's a mainstream view in Chinese history prior to, let's say, the mid-19th century. What it meant to be Chinese was more a matter of, whether you identify with the culture, which is Confucian, but not only Confucian, whether you participate in certain family rituals, whether you speak the language, whether you eat Chinese food, and so on. And in the Tang Dynasty, for example, which was relatively open, no matter where you're from, you could participate in the examinations to put you on the road to political power. So you had officials from Arab countries, from Korea, and that were often quite successful. Of course, there were people, people are off, it's not unique to China, but people are often blindly prejudiced, you know, and that's true throughout history in China as well, and very arbitrary factors, including how people look, you know, influence their actions. But the mainstream view among the elite was that being Chinese is a matter of being civilized into certain cultural categories, and that anybody could do that in principle. It didn't depend on your ethnicity or race. Now that changed more in the mid-19th century, more in response to Western intervention in China. And I think the Chinese elite tried to learn from the West how to be powerful and rich. And one of the, I think, wrong lessons that was learned was that it's important to divide the world into races and to strive to strengthen our own race. And that led to this emphasis on using race and ethnicity as a category for determining who counts as Chinese. But now that China is becoming strong again, I think it could revert back to its, or let's say in a more modernized form, its mainstream idea that being Chinese is more a matter of culture rather than race. And I think that's a healthy phenomenon. Now, why that piece in the Wall Street Journal attracted a lot of, let's say, not so enthusiastic response, I think that was more, to be frank, is one sentence that I wrote about, I compared China to the US, and I said, look, in the US, and I'm from Canada, it's hard for me to say flattering comments about the US, but nonetheless, I said it. I said, you know, you could be American regardless of your ethnicity, and I said, you know, and I compared that a bit to China. We're saying, no, it's much harder in China. And many Asian Americans were very upset at that comment because they said, well, it's not as simple as you say, you know. Even for us, you know, we're not always viewed as Americans. They often ask, you know, which part of, they say that race and ethnicity is also an obstacle to being viewed as an American. And that I guess I should have recognized that in the article. Of course, there's a limit to how much you could write. But it's more because of that view that the article generated hostility, not so much because of the view that, you know, we should place more emphasis on culture as a standard for determining who counts as Chinese in China. I mean, most of my friends in China, you know, intellectuals anyway, are, you know, generally agree with that view.
Isn't it also that what you have in mind is a Pax Seneca idea about the greater China, that its cultural influence, its economic influence is going to be. But exactly because of that, within the past 2 years, there's a strong reaction for this Chinese influence. Confucius Institute is one that a lot of people are very skeptical about this. And also, people are complaining about one belt, one road, so on and so forth. What's your response to that?
Well, I mean, I think that's a different issue, right? I mean, this is really an issue for, you know, what standard we should use to determine who counts as Chinese.
Right.
And also, it's to a certain extent, it's a legal issue, right? Who should be a Chinese citizen? Should ethnicity or race be the key criterion, or should it be a more open category like it is in Canada or the US and arguably in China's past? So my article was really about that. Now, Confucius, now the other issue maybe that you're suggesting is that there's worry outside of China about China's projecting its power in ways that are unwelcome. Now that might be true. I mean, but I do think that sometimes those fears are overplayed. I mean, the Confucius Institutes, for example, focus mainly on teaching the Chinese language, and they're very helpful especially in countries or in universities in wealthier countries that don't have their own resources to do it. And they provide aid, which is to do that, and also they do things. I mean, I've been to many conferences, you know, sponsored by the Confucius Institutes that work on issues that wouldn't be otherwise supported. For example, in South Africa, we had a conference comparing Confucianism with Ubuntu, which is a sub-Saharan ethical tradition, sponsored by the Confucius Institutes. You know, who would sponsor that kind of workshop other than them? You know, we went to one in Iceland where we compared Nordic, culture and views on solidarity with kind of Chinese views with Chinese philosophy. I mean, so I think they're sponsoring workshops that wouldn't otherwise be supported. So in some sense, they should be viewed in a welcome way as expanding the discourse. Now, of course, if Confucius Institutes are used to limit discourse on issues that would otherwise take place, and that's something to worry about. And maybe in retrospect, maybe it wasn't necessarily a great idea to embed them in universities, which in principle should really be as free as possible, right? But I don't think that per se.
It may be better that it's like a British Council, that is an independent one.
Right. In retrospect, that may have been a better way of doing it.
Finally, I want to ask about why and how you end up in China and teaching in a Chinese university. I mean, you have been in China for over 15 years now. What is your story? Why make you decided to stay in China?
Well, so I could trace a kind of more academic story, which is probably not the true story, but the academic story is that I worked on communitarianism as a graduate student, and my first job was as a graduate student in Oxford, and my first job was in Singapore, where there was a big debate about Asian values, which I thought was quite empty. But when I looked into it in more detail and looked at the Confucian part of the debate, then I thought, this is interesting. And Confucianism has intellectual resources that are similar to the communitarian debate, but actually richer and more diverse, and can provide new perspectives. And it made sense to dive deeper into the Confucian part. And of course, to dive more into the Confucian part, you have to learn the language, and then ultimately it helps to be based too in Shandong province, which is the home ground of Confucianism. If I were to reconstruct a rational story, that would be the story that I would say. But of course, the true story is that when I was in Oxford, I met a woman from China. We got married, and we decided to, and I'd learn Chinese more so I could understand her parents and her friends, and then became much more interested in China as a result of that.
But a lot of people, when they learn the language, they study in Chinese, and then they move back to the West, like move back to Canada, if you're in your case, rather than stay on in China.
Well, I guess I just.
You must have getting an offer during the course, right?
Yeah, I mean, I still go back to Canada, usually twice a year to see my mother and my friends and and other family members. But somehow, look, I'm interested in political ideas, right?
Right.
I mean, what's the future of China? Is it Confucian? Is it socialist? Is it liberal? I mean, these debates are so fascinating to me. Much more fascinating, to be frank, than the debates that occur in Canada. So, as a matter of intellectual interest, of course, my heart now is also in China. But even as a matter of intellectual interest, I do think that it's a fascinating time to be in China.
Thank you very much, Professor Bell, for your time.
Thank you.
也谢谢各位观众收看，我们下次见。